Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Farm.One podcast. I'm joined here today by Michael Chin, our VP of Corporate Development. Hello, Michael.
Hello.
And we're back from our Thanksgiving break, and we're going to dive into a bunch of news stories that Michael's going to introduce. But firstly, I'm just going to very quickly go through what's in this week's bag. We have in the blue box, which is herbs and flowers, we've got Nepentala stems, fragrant and minty. We've got Pluto basil, amazing sort of aromatic cinnamon flavor and aroma. We've got summer savory. We've got some beautiful violas. And then in the yellow box, which is baby microgreens, we've got micro carrot, which is awesome. Scarlet frills mustard and Miss America, which are both little mild mustardy flavor. And then we've got the red box, which is our baby greens with a mixture of baby, red streak, Mizuno. We got Toscano kale, we got red kale, some all-star lettuce mix, and then Hong Vit radish, which is great as well. So our members can look forward to that this week, being delivered by bike in reusable containers. Enough about the box. Oh, and also we're calling it, what are we calling it? The We're Stuffed bag this week, because we had a little bit too much to eat over Thanksgiving. I don't know what you had, Michael, but we made all kinds of things. We did some roast Brussels sprouts. I did like some pickled shallots, which are great. I always forget how easy it is to like pickle little things and then use them as a garnish. Really, really great tip. And we did some mashed potato with garlic and then some caramelized onion gravy. And we did, I did a pie. I did a savory pie, including one of the meat substitutes that we talked about last week. I used a Beyond sausage, leek and mushroom pie. It was super nice and savory. And then we made an apple pie, and then these things that we call lemon chewies, which are like a sort of ginger nut biscuit type flapjacky iced sort of delight. So anyway, too much food. What about you, Michael? How was your Thanksgiving?
It was great. Nothing compared to what you had. I got some sushi, very traditional, right, for Thanksgiving. But I did try the Beyond Burger this weekend.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was very interesting. And it was delicious, I thought, for what it was. And
what prompted that? What was the reason behind it?
Some of the conversations we've been having on this podcast, some of the things we've been talking about, and it's in virtually every supermarket these days, so that's great. And so I decided to try it, and it was pretty good. You know what I like about it is they got some of the subtle flavors right. So, the texture and all of that, you sort of bite into it and it's not really beef. And, you can kind of sense that. But they got the taste of that kind of grilled or griddled burger flavor. So I thought that was really cool. That was really encouraging. And I think I can totally see, how this will play especially in fast food. And these burger joints, and I think the impact of this at scale, particularly at places like McDonald's, like we've talked about with the McPlant and others, I think is actually really promising, and I'm really hopeful. So it was quite fun.
I mean, my take on it sometimes is like Beyond Burger and Impossible Burger. Sometimes it's sort of like a good truck stop burger in a way. It's like a sort of, it's not really like the sort of big gourmet burgers that you might get somewhere. It's more like a quicker, thinner sort of maybe quite fatty char grilled kind of burger. But yeah, they're good sometimes. And it's great that the product's out there. It's great that you tried it as well. Very cool.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Good.
And just along those lines, I ended up going to their website. So for those of you that are interested, they're doing a Cyber Monday deal. I think it's 20%.
Oh, really? I had never really thought about going to like a burger company's website to buy something, but okay.
Yeah,
all right.
I didn't either, but I guess they're shipping direct, which is also quite interesting. But
yeah, I wonder if they're going to keep on doing that. That must be it's because it's just such a completely separate business to selling to like a huge chain or something, isn't it? Like, let's see if that continues. Well,
Yeah.
good. So it's November the 30th. Is that right? As we speak. What's in the news this week from around vertical farming, urban farming, food industry? What's going on?
Yeah, we've got a few, I guess, macro industry things that popped up on our radar. So we've talked a lot on this podcast in previous episodes about investing in the food tech and ag tech space and all the innovation that's happening. And there was a new fund that was raised by a venture fund called Astanor Ventures out of Europe. I think this is their second fund. They started in 2017. They raised $325 million. So this was reported in TechCrunch. And they're calling it their Global Impact Fund. And they're concentrating it on food and agriculture technology. And they plan to deploy it throughout Europe and North America. And it's interesting to see them take this approach of food and ag tech, but really focused on the climate debate. So I thought that was very, very interesting. So as opposed to some of the venture funds and some of the investments that we've talked about already, where they're, I guess, chasing the billions of dollars purely for disrupting the ag and the food industry. They're taking a much broader global impact and impact investing approach to what they're doing. What's driving this is also really interesting. They're citing that, obviously climate change and the climate crisis and greenhouse emissions, but they're looking at data points like 70% of the world's freshwater resources are consumed by agriculture. Clearly unsustainable. Excuse me. The Earth's soil is degrading. Fertile soil is being lost at a rate of 24 billion tons a year. Food waste is also a huge issue. Some 40% of food goes to waste. And we're also looking at much less biodiversity from the monoculture that we're seeing in agriculture of probably the last couple of decades, where most fruit and vegetables have 15% fewer nutrients than they did in 1950. So some of their past investments since 2017 in a French insect farmer named Winesect. InFarm, which we know a lot about, vertical farming company based out of Berlin. Notpla, a UK-based company seeking to eliminate plastics by creating highly functional packaging material from seaweed, which I think is awesome. And a California-based food waste reduction company called Appeal. So they're dealing with the food waste issue. So that's kind of interesting. Before we kind of dive into some of these areas that they're looking at and some of the driving issues, what are your thoughts overall on a fund like this and taking kind of the impact investment route?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think if you look at both, from the public market end, there's increasing desire from consumers, even passive investors, I would say, to have a portfolio or even an index fund or whatever of investments that are at least clean. I think we started with sort of like trying to eliminate really dirty, fossil fuel stocks and maybe ethically questionable stocks. But now I think there's probably desire from a lot of consumers just to go more and more into companies that are actually actively doing good. And I think if you look on the public markets, there's not thousands and thousands of companies to choose from at that point. And then when you contrast some of these companies' public messages with actually looking inside their supply chains, it may be difficult to find like truly ethical investments. And so I think that now and over the next 20 years, if you look at IPOs and if you look at new companies entering the public markets, you're going to see appetite from investors to pick those companies that are aligned with sustainable development goals, that have from the beginning been set up to be companies that are ethical, maybe have something in mind like climate change. And so I think that makes sense from that perspective long term, right? You're trying to pick the companies that are eventually going to go public in that way. And I think in the shorter term, if you look at angel investing, as for instance, which is obviously normally the stage before a VC gets their money in, a lot of angel investors, a lot of small investors are really looking for those investments where they're companies that are seen to be doing good. And what you'll find, as you know, Michael, and if you look around the angel investment kind of world, you have these kind of high net worth individuals, particularly on the younger side, who are looking to really use their money as a force for good in the world. And what people end up doing a lot of the time is aligning behind a particular cause, of course. So it could be climate, it could be education for women, it could be something to do with the ocean. It could be a million things, right? So and so they're looking for companies that have that kind of focus. And the Sustainable Development Goals is a sort of framework that I think this fund has mentioned as part of the way it looks at things. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a lot of sort of themes there that you can kind of pick up on, and companies can kind of fit into one of those buckets. The Sustainable Development Goals, I have to say, are quite broad. I mean, there's 17 of them. And so, I think, and number 17, I think, if I'm right, is partnerships for the goals. And so you can actually have a theme which is about all of these things. But just to pick some other ones, we've got reduced inequality, we've got zero hunger, we've got no poverty, good health and well-being, affordable clean energy. So you can see these are themes that a lot of companies and young folks can sort of pick up on. And I think it just makes a lot of sense. So, the thing that I think that's great about funds starting like this is it also pushes other funds, VCs who've been around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, to then, have another look at their own portfolio and look at, oh, okay, are we sort of supporting all these goals sufficiently? And over time, the question for founders is, of course, going to be like, okay, if I get an equivalent offer from a traditional VC that doesn't really seem to have any portfolio focus around, doing good, or if I have an offer from a fund which is all about positive impact, and that fund can potentially connect with other entrepreneurs that have impact or other companies and can sort of promote that way of doing things, then as a founder, it might be quite attractive to go with a fund like that's more impact focused. And the last thing I would say from a very cynical point of view is, there's lots and lots of funds get started all the time, and VCs and investors of all types are really just trying to differentiate themselves, and a lot of them, they put up a website that looks a lot like the website of the guys down the street, and all the faces look very similar to the guys down the street. And so, this kind of thing, this kind of theming is obviously a strategy to get in front of founders and get noticed in a way that you might not if you just start a VC fund called, like, I don't know, Granite Capital or something, and it's made of your two buddies from Stanford, and it's just the same as everything else. So it makes a lot of sense to me, and I think some of the investments that you've mentioned, Apeel, Nopla, Infarm, obviously, there's some companies that have obviously made some headway in this space, and so it does seem like they've picked a few interesting companies already.
$325 million is a really decent sized fund for a multi-stage investor. So there's a lot that they can do with that, both in terms of backing some companies that are really pushing the boundaries, and then also boundaries of innovation, that is, but then also deploy that capital to some of the later stage companies where it's about getting those businesses to a more mature state and to a market. So that's really promising. The other thing that was interesting in the article, which you alluded to, a point that you alluded to as well, is that they're seeing the demand from their LPs, so their limited partners, whether they're larger pension funds and the like, but also family offices, where you're seeing this new generation of investors that are interested in impact investing and that type of thing. So overall, and all said, really promising, which also leads to the second set of articles that I thought would be interesting to talk about. And we've been talking a lot about plant-based alternatives and some of the larger chain restaurants and the like. But there were two articles that really stood out over the last week, and one was IKEA, which we all, I'm sure, have strong memories of and connections to as teenagers. Um, but they're making
Yeah.
50% of their food menu plant-based by 2025. So they've made that pledge, and it's solely, or they're connecting it to their sustainability commitments. And they plan to transition 80% of their packaged meals to plant-based, giving its 680 million customers more sustainable options. And what they found was that 75% of their consumers across 27 countries want to make more sustainable choices. And they're thinking about it too as very much a circular economy. So they're starting to do the research and development over the next 5 years to not just look at the food that they're sourcing and adding to their menus, but looking at it from an entire food value chain perspective. So also with sustainable packaging and the like. And together with this, Marks and Spencer's, which is a UK-based company, also launched a new innovation hub to develop plant-based foods and plastic-free packaging solutions. Sorry. Their approach here is also very interesting. So they're creating an in-house specialist team. So they've identified initially 9 different areas that they think that they need to do work around. And so the idea there for them is that they want to have this team that sits alone in-house, outside of their current business and their traditional business, where they can solely focus on developing these new alternatives and these new approaches, and also tying it to achieving a circular system where single-use materials are eliminated in favor of reuse and recycled alternatives. And one idea that they are working on, which I think is really cool, is to divert hard to recycle waste from landfills by turning it into new products such as playground equipment. So, this, along with some of the companies like McDonald's and others that we've talked about, Nestle has also talked about growing their plant-based category sales by 40%. Unilever has set a goal of 1.19 billion in annual sales from plant-based meat and dairy alternatives. And Tesco also has a 5-year commitment to increase sales of plant-based meat alternatives by 300%. So it sure seems like this stuff's going mainstream, and that soon maybe these won't be the alternatives. Maybe these will be the staples. But that's really encouraging, that to see businesses like this kind of switch to this, or at least put some real resources behind it.
Yeah, I mean, starting with IKEA, I think that one of the things is that people sort of forget is how huge the footprint of IKEA is. We're talking right now in the U.S. Obviously, it's a Swedish company being around for a long, long time. My family's first experience of IKEA would have been around 37 to 40 years ago, I think. And they've just gone from strength to strength. And I think as a brand, in people's minds, a lot of people have really fond sort of feelings towards IKEA. You think about furniture that you had as a kid, you think about going to the store as a kid, and that's kind of how they get you, right? They get you with the cheap meal. And for families, certainly it's a place where you can feed your kids actually very affordably, right? And maybe one or other of the parents stays with the kids for a while in the restaurant, while the other parent has a breather and goes and actually finds and hunts down all the items in the store. And just as Costco has been able to provide very, very low-cost meals, and that being part of their kind of value package, right? If you think about the experience of visiting a store, that's part of that value package, is that $1.50 hot dog, right? IKEA has done that with its meatballs, and the meatballs have been this sort of international export from Sweden in a way that, very few other products have. And certainly we, if you ask a regular person on the street, what is Swedish cuisine, they're probably going to have to think for a few seconds before they think about maybe some smoked fish, some cranberries, or I can't remember the other type of berry.
Lingonberry.
Anyway, it'll come to me. But, lingonberry, exactly. Of course, we eat them all the time, right? No, we don't, because the meatballs at IKEA and those boiled potatoes and that sauce, that is sort of Sweden, and that is like family weekends for a lot of people. And certainly, I still think of, I very nearly bought an IKEA desk on the weekend. I didn't for various reasons, but it's still a brand that, whatever your choices are, whatever your designs that you prefer, it's still a brand that almost everyone would consider for certain items. And so for them to, make a statement like this and to move towards more plant-based options on the menu, it has a huge impact. I can't remember the exact stats, but if you look at it in terms of meals served, IKEA is one of the biggest food service providers in the world, which is pretty staggering. And so if you can get even a small proportion of those people to even try a plant-based option on that menu, I think that's significant. And then I think the other thing that's interesting about that to me is that proportion, trying to get 50% of that menu to be plant-based. I don't know what the baseline is right now, and sometimes it's easy to kind of obscure that. And if you include French fries in that, obviously then you're sort of giving yourself a boost. But even so, I think it starts to reach this point on menus where it's not just, a couple of options to please the vegetarians and the member of the family who's on a diet right now. It's sort of becomes front and center on that menu, which means that people who've never sort of considered plant-based options before start to be confronted with them in a way that is sort of unavoidable. And so when big brands start to do that, certainly in a food service setting like quick service, where you'll see the menu and it's very much like there's only kind of 4 places to put a menu item, right? When you go to IKEA, it becomes very, very, very prominent. And that's where I think it starts to become really interesting, because it starts to affect bigger proportions of society, and it starts to make people who would normally scoff at the idea of not having meat for lunch or dinner, to make them go like, oh, okay, this is how it is now, So I think it's really interesting. I think it's good. I think overall, IKEA has a lot of sustainability initiatives, and actually they've, invested in vertical farming in various forms. I think I'm right in saying they may have invested in Aero Farms or one of the other folks, but they've been interested in this whole approach, and they have to be, because they're a company that has such huge impact in terms of the material used, in terms of the footprint, in terms of their dining options that they offer. Such a huge impact, and so I'm really glad that they're thinking about this. And then when it comes to Marks and Spencer, as someone from the UK, did Marks and Spencer ever end up in Singapore? Yep, by the way,
Yep,
they did. Okay, yeah, but it was, they were doing clothing as well as food,
yep.
Or just food, or
clothing as well.
Yeah, I remember them being in Hong Kong, and I remember my mom being disappointed because they didn't offer like the same range of sizes. They had a different size range. But Marks and Spencer is, as someone who grew up partially in the UK, it's something where everyone in the UK has this kind of mixed emotions about Marks and Spencer. It's a very familiar sort of traditional brand, but also, they were seen not to be moving forward. The clothing went through all these ups and downs. And so I think that, we have this mixed emotion about them. And certainly when it comes to their food offerings, I have to say that my, instant sort of reaction to Marks and Spencer is lots of really nice stuff, loads of packaging, very, very, like even these tiny things, like when you walk in, very, very cold, grocery stores, and everyone working there wearing these big fleecy outfits because it's freezing cold, but lots and lots of packaging. And, when you look at where they're sourcing a lot of these items, certainly in the UK, they have had this commitment to giving people blackberries and blueberries and raspberries and strawberries year round, right? So they're coming from Kenya, often in the UK, and they're coming from other places where, the food miles are just really, really significant. And so I think that, it obviously makes sense that they're trying to change things. And I certainly know even 15 years ago, they launched the Plan A initiative because there's no Plan B for the climate and that kind of thing. I don't, it's hard when you have companies that make these announcements and then, the retail experience or the customer experience doesn't really seem to necessarily support these kind of things. And so it'd be interesting to see if these things start to come into alignment and some of the, overall corporate goals start to match with the retail experience. So I'm curious, and I'll see, but it's obviously good, that companies are making these kind of announcements. And, finally, just to segue into these bits about the innovation labs and that kind of thing, you've also seen Nestle, I can't remember the exact name, but they launched a packaging institute in Switzerland, I think about a year and a half ago, which was specifically around trying to innovate around new forms of packaging, plastic, reusables, that kind of thing. And it's an approach I think you're familiar with, Michael, in terms of like creating like an innovation zone, an innovation hub within a company. Sometimes people call it like a skunk works, or sometimes they turn into these sort of other R&D areas. And of course, the advantage is supposed to be that these folks can operate somewhat independently, have a lot of freedom, not be bogged down with the admin of the larger company, but have its support when they need it. Sometimes people manage to do that really effectively. Sometimes people don't. And it's definitely not a silver bullet. Of course, you get more freedom, but then potentially you don't get as much support. And, if you come up with things that aren't necessarily helpful to the larger company, you may be, sort of tossed to one side. But yeah, lots of sort of interesting things happening there. I'm curious about your perspective about innovation hubs, innovation labs, whatever you want to call them, and whether they work and how to make them successful.
Yeah, and I think the challenge there for a lot of large companies. So I did some consulting work a while back where I helped build out a marketing innovation lab for a large consumer packaged goods company out in New Jersey. And one of the big learnings from that was, it's the old innovator's dilemma story, right? When you have the entire machinery of a company trying to eke out your, X% growth every quarter, you tend to have a culture that is very geared towards that. The problem with innovation within that is you make a lot of quote unquote mistakes, right? So of the X number of things that you do, that Y number of them will fail. And that percentage can be quite high. When you're managing a business against, particularly a traditional business like this, against a very small, probably single percentage growth every quarter, those mistakes add up and become a problem. So the big learning there, I think, for a lot of these companies is, particularly when they look at businesses like Alphabet and what they're doing with X, and you look at the tech industry in Silicon Valley and how quickly they're able to move, kind of that fail fast approach. It's very difficult to do at a large company. So I think it's smart to isolate that, because if you're tied to the big machine, just by the way that the expectations and structures and culture and everything else, you tend to run into these types of problems. Now, of course, in theory, if you can crack that nut with a small innovation group that's agile, that's accountable by a different measure, to be able to scale that, the likes of a Marks and Spencer's, of a Unilever, Nestle, and others, the potential is there, right? And that's where the promise is. And of course, companies aren't exactly doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're certainly feeling pressure, I'm sure. We just talked about funds like Astanor and some of the innovation that's happening. And clearly we're hitting a point where this maybe isn't the alternative anymore. Maybe we're not that far off of this being mainstream. So all of that's really great and really encouraging. And I do think that big companies like this are going to move the needle. I'm curious what you think the opportunities are for vertical farming. You know, so they've got to source these ingredients from somewhere, right? So it would be on from peas and pea protein. But what are your thoughts, sort of technically, in terms of what the opportunity might be for vertical farmers to try to meet what, you know, will potentially be a pretty big demand down the road?
In terms of
That's right.
plant-based
Yeah.
proteins and sort of meat substitutes. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, most of those sort of ingredients, and yeah, you mentioned pea protein. There's a lot of soy, obviously, traditionally. There's a lot of stuff like that. Of course, you know, people are trying to make these meat substitutes as affordable as possible, and um, you know, they're spending a lot of money up front on innovation, which isn't about materials cost, but there's a big cost there. And then, you know, there's sometimes a somewhat complex manufacturing process, I would say. But then you're trying to source, you know, bulk materials. And so I would guess that most of the time vertical farming isn't really going to be a viable technique for that kind of stuff, just given the quantities that you're going to need. And certainly, you know, um, one of the reasons why animal agriculture is a problem for the climate is just the huge amounts of land that are taken up for growing soy and other, you know, crops to feed livestock, you know. And so that gives you a sense of the scale that's required just to produce enough of this, you know, this kind of material. And so I don't think vertical farming is going to fit in necessarily there, but I think that you know, absolutely, if you look at IKEA, right, producing their plant-based meatballs, there's probably, I want to say, billions of meatballs or maybe trillions of meatballs that need to be made. And so, you know, thinking about vertical integration, thinking about where you're going to get these crops long term is going to be like a really important question, you know, firstly from the logistics side, but also from the sustainability side. Are you sourcing, you know, this crop from, you know, land that was previously rainforest or, you know, the Amazon basin, etc.? You know, that's hugely problematic. And so I think that it's definitely going to come into a question of, like, you know, just thinking through that logistics for these companies. And I think that, you know, that's one of the things about vertical farming that we sort of have to keep on communicating and talking through is, like, you know, what is the purpose of this kind of farm? Should we be growing bulk crops that can be grown outdoors? If we project, you know, 20 or 30 years in the future, are we going to have to be using more of this kind of farming because viable farmland is going to be in short supply? You know, how might that go? And so the answer now seems to be really obvious. Like, you probably shouldn't grow soy in a vertical farm. But you know, in 50 years time, I don't know. And so, you know, hopefully we've got, you know, still really good kind of control or use of agricultural land. Hopefully water use, you know, can be managed, but, you know, these things are becoming increasingly sort of in question. And certainly we've seen in the weather this year, you know, in California, which is very drought prone, and that's very much because of agriculture. You know, things that used to be predictable are not anymore. So we'll see.
Which leads us to the final article that I wanted to talk about. So this was in the Guardian, and you had actually sent it around to the team on Slack. And the headline is you know, certainly gets your attention. The headline is 1% of farms operates 70% of the world's farmland. So this is based on a study by the International Land Coalition, and what they did was they compiled 17 different research papers and analyzed the data. One of the data points is that 80% of small holdings of less than 2 hectares are generally excluded from global food chains. And a couple of other data points that I want to share with you. Asia and Africa have the highest levels of small holdings, where human input tends to be higher than chemical and mechanical factors, and where timeframes are more likely to be for generations rather than 10-year investment cycles. And the other point of note that I thought was interesting is this this isn't the way that it's always been, right? Since 1980, over the past 4 decades, the biggest shift from small to big was in the United States and Europe, where ownership is in fewer hands and even individual farmers work under strict contracts for retailers, trading conglomerates, and investment funds. Um, and here's the problem. The article in the study states that you end up having a concentration of ownership and controlled results in a greater push for monoculture and more intensive agriculture, as investment funds tend to work in 10-year cycles to generate returns. So, you've got impacts on unemployment, uh, exploitation of the workforce, unequal wealth generation. You've got mass migration that you're seeing with people being displaced and an increase in the rural and urban divide. I think we saw that a lot come up in this recent election and a lot of the debate around what's happening in the United States. We've talked a lot about environmental degradation today as a result of monocultures, soil erosion. They also cite a democracy crisis, um, where you've got these elite-based policies in agriculture, which also then leads to social inequality and health insecurity. So, there's a lot there, and it's pretty heavy stuff. But tied back to kind of where things are going, and what we've already talked about today, it does feel like maybe there's an opportunity for a bit of a reset. And again, sort of, what's the role for new entrepreneurs, new farmers? You might not own farmland today, but what technology and innovation, look at what we're doing in vertical farming, starting to put some of that into the hands of more and more people, and locally and regionally, all seems to be good stuff. Um, Curious on your reaction to all of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely unlike The Guardian to have a, you know, very joyful, like positive article, right? So this kind of fits into, a mold, and that makes sense. But no, I mean, it is sort of scary stuff when you put it in those kinds of terms, right? This, monoculture, massive farms, very few, very small number of kind of companies controlling such huge amounts of land. And yeah, I think the exciting thing is, and the reason why a lot of folks get interested in vertical farming and other forms of urban agriculture is that there is this chance to maybe push back against that and to start things and to attract new people in. If you combine some of those stats with the data around the average age of farmers in the U.S., it's sort of late 50s, I think. A lot of people are kind of aging out of that profession, and it's turned into something where, yeah, it's not really a family kind of business anymore. Yeah, those are some of the reasons why people get excited about vertical farming, because you can do smaller things. You can do it in cities. You can do it closer to people. You can do it more accessibly. You can do it with a much more sort of reliable picture of, you know, your the climate. You're kind of climate independent, and so yeah, there's some kind of good positive moves against those trends. But yeah, it is kind of scary just to see those numbers. And if you take it back to the point about sourcing and crops and what people are actually growing on these farms, and if you look at that, a lot of that farmland is devoted to feedstock for factory farming. So crops like soy and others that are used to feed livestock in factory farming, as opposed to animals feeding on grass or other sort of pasture. So yeah, depressing numbers. I think, like, if you, as far as I can see, maybe, it's hard to know, right? You have this kind of beta Meinhof effect where it's like the more you're conscious of this stuff, the more articles you see. And so you wonder, like, is this stuff reaching the news more, or am I just reading more of this stuff? And I don't know, but I think that certainly, people's understanding of the climate impact of agriculture is a lot more developed than it was maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And then the technologies that have allowed kind of new kinds of farming, or an interest in new kinds of farming, have evolved as well. And so, we know, for instance, mushroom farmers. You mentioned an insect farmer just now. We know strawberry farmers. We know people who are doing things, indoors, outdoors, urban settings, that kind of thing. There is lots of cool stuff going on, and I think the other news that you mentioned about the funds investing in not just climate but also ag and food tech shows that there's huge financial interest, and so I think we will see some disruption of that status quo. But that's why for me, I think I like to support those companies that are kind of pushing back against that monoculture, pushing back against mega sized farms and doing things that are much more human in scale. I think that's good for everything. And if you make the analogy to the internet, right? We've got a huge problem right now with Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon. I shouldn't forget Amazon, like owning such a huge portion of what we do every day. And so it just can't be good, right? We have to have mechanisms against that. We have to push against that. And one of the best ways to push against that is innovation. And trying to democratize things and make things a little bit more accessible to everyone. So I hope that happens. But yeah, it's kind of scary numbers.
Yeah, I think it is, but I also think it's really promising. I mean, that's what I think this week's sort of collection of news, on the surface, you're sort of like, this is, but I don't know. I find it really promising that you're seeing funds of that size, like what Astanor is doing. I think we're starting to see some really interesting things happening in the developing world as well, which, we're seeing that happen in Africa and other places in Asia as well. And, I think we've also seen this happen with renewable energy. Renewable energy is now cheaper in many places than fossil fuels, and of course the oil and gas companies are going to continue to try to eke out as much as they can. But the reality is you're fighting against a fact, the truth of the world of finite resources, and I think that applies to agriculture and the food system as well. And to your point, the innovation's good, and it does seem like we are at this really interesting turning point. And for better or worse, COVID has shown that we need better supply chains, a more resilient supply chain, and hopefully all of this is leading to some really good stuff for the industry and for humanity as a whole. So
sounds good. Sounds like a reasonable place to end, I think, with some positive thoughts, post Thanksgiving into the rest of the year. And so we're going to be joining everyone next week again for another episode of the podcast. I don't know exactly if we're going to have a guest. We're going to see. It might be a COVID-related question, because some people have got to be quarantining and all that kind of thing. So we'll let you know. But in the meantime, please like and subscribe. There's some links down the bottom of the screen here if you're watching on video. If you're not watching on video, you should try it out. You get to see beautiful images of our farm and the things that we do in here. But also you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher and all those other good places. So with that, we'll leave you there. Thank you very much for tuning into the Farm.One podcast. I'm Robert Lang. I'm with Michael Chin. And we're going to say goodbye.
Bye. See you next week.
Goodbye.